Well, good afternoon, everyone in the audience across Australia and throughout the Asia region, and good morning to those joining us from the UK and other countries overseas. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and pay our joint respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Very warm welcome to this exclusive Advanced Connect Roundtable with Professor John Mattick AO on the fascinating topic of the transformation of personal health and healthcare systems by genomics and smart sensors and overcoming challenges to that. My name is Doug Ferguson. I'm the New South Wales Chairman of KPMG and partner in charge of our Asia business, but I'm also a very proud board member of Advance. I was delighted to be asked by Chairman of Advance, Yasmin Allen, who I acknowledge today to open today's discussion. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd also like to acknowledge the Honourable Jillian Skinner, who served as the New South Wales Health Minister and Shadow Health Minister for over 20 years. Also like to acknowledge John Kinghorn of the Kinghorn Foundation, whose philanthropic investment made possible the Kinghorn Centre for Clinical Genomics at the Garvan Institute. And finally, my great friend and fellow Advanced board member and non-executive director of the Garvan Institute, Michael Cannon-Brooks Senior. May I also thank our event hosts this evening, Gilbert and Tobin, who are long-standing partners of Advance, and special thanks to their partners, John Williamson Noble and Tim Gordon, who will move the vote of thanks towards the end of the night. It's through the generosity and the commitment of our partners like G&T and also our federal government that we're able to continue to uncover, recognise and celebrate the work of world-class global Australians like John. Okay, let me briefly share with you how today's program will unfold. I'll briefly introduce John. He'll make his opening remarks for 20 minutes. Then Maria MacNamara, the CEO of Advance, will facilitate Q&A for about 40 minutes, and we'll close the session after a vote of thanks by G&T at about 6:45. Please ask questions. Use the emoji at the bottom right of your screen and raise your hand. Please keep your camera on and your sound on mute unless you're asking a question. And just a reminder, this session will be recorded and a summary prepared for you all tomorrow. And with that, please allow me to introduce our honoured guest. Professor John Mattick AO is the Sharp Professor of RNA Biology at the University of New South Wales and the winner of the 2019 Advanced Global Impact Award. Rather than share John's extensive biography with you, I'll now ask Ivany and the Advance team to share a video that was prepared for the Advance Awards Gala dinner last year. So Ivany, over to you.
In his stellar career as a genome scientist, John Mattick has transformed the world's understanding of the human genome. He was recently Chief Executive of Genomics England, which was established to develop genome analysis for disease diagnosis and better healthcare. Prior to that, he was Director of the Garvan Institute of Medical Research and the Foundation Director of the Institute for Molecular Bioscience, IMB, at the University of Queensland. John's goal is to understand how the information suite that we inherit from our ancestors, the human genome with a size equivalent of just 6 gigabytes, specifies a complex organism that can walk and talk. His research has shown that the human genome is not full of evolutionary junk as had previously been thought, but rather is mostly devoted to the production of regulatory ribonucleic acid that direct our development. His work impacts the scientific community's fundamental understanding of the human genome and is a major innovation in the field of genomic programming. He's published over 300 scientific articles, which have been cited over 60,000 times, putting him in the top 1% of highly cited academic authors. In addition to his world-leading research, John is internationally recognised for his leadership of prime research institutes in Australia and around the world.
What a great way to introduce John. Since receiving his prestigious Advance Award last October, John has returned to Australia from Oxford University and is now based at UNSW. He's currently writing a book on the misunderstanding of molecular biology, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that tonight. We're indeed hugely privileged to have one of the world's foremost experts on human genome share his thoughts with us today. Please welcome Professor John Mattick AO.
Thank you, Doug, and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along, and I hope you enjoy the discussion and take part in it. I'll speak, as Doug mentioned, for about 20 minutes just to give some thoughts to promote the discussion. But before I do, I want to thank Doug and Ivani and Maria, who's going to be asking some more questions later, the advanced team, and also Gilbert and Tobin for hosting this session. I often wonder about where to start because there's so much to say, but just to pick up on where Doug left off, most of my scientific life I've been intrigued by the fact that the human genome programs the development of each one of us from a single cell to 60 trillion or so with bones, muscles, organs and a brain that can walk, talk, write music, design spacecraft, and this extraordinary information suite. I must say, from a personal point of view, I see biology more in informational terms than I do in chemical terms, but both are important, of course. I've spent much of my scientific career curious about the information in the genome, and particularly the conclusion from many years ago that the 99% of our genome which doesn't code for conventional genes must be junk. And of course, the obvious alternative is that it's not, and there's another form of information. And I think that's proving to be true. And that information is actually designed to take us from that single cell to a mature organism. So I won't burden you too much about more with that unless people want to ask questions, but move on to the main topic of the discussion. And that's how genomics can radically improve our health and healthcare systems. And again, along the way, I've always been interested in how we scientists actually make our work, our understanding, our insights, to the extent we have them, useful to the public, because that's really our main mission. And it occurred to me very early on that the information in the human genome was going to be very, very valuable for improving our healthcare system, which is really still, well, perhaps I should say it straight out, it's the last of the great cottage industries, and it's always been pitched at the average because we've never been able, or not until recently, been able to get under the hood to understand how we're different from each other. But of course, it's obvious that we all are. And those genetic differences not only affect our physical differences and to some extent, perhaps a large extent, our psychosocial differences, but also our different susceptibilities to disease. So over the last 2 decades, there's been the most extraordinary technical revolution, as most of you are aware, to the point where we can now sequence human genome for about $600 US. And the technology is already really there to sequence it for $100. The major company or companies are promising to bring it down to $100. They're in no rush to do so because they're making so much money at the moment, but new technologies are coming on board and we'll see those competitive pressures increase. Now, when it got down to 1,000 Australian or $1,000 and the Kinghorn, John and Jill Kinghorn stepped in and gave us at the Garvan the funds to purchase that equipment, we were really able to feasibly think about translating that into the clinic, both for the diagnosis of so-called rare disease, genetic disorders, but also for cancer, and I'll come back to both of those in a moment, but also to start on a journey towards wellness in terms of understanding and taking into account our genetic differences in our not only diagnosis and treatment of existing conditions, but mitigating the risk of future conditions. Now, I want you to imagine, and I think the nation needs to imagine, what the future of healthcare could and will look like in 10 years' time or 20 years' time when the cost of doing a genome sequence is only $100. And I put it to you, and that it's impossible to imagine a future for healthcare, whether it's individual healthcare at the GP level, or at the specialist level, or at the system management level, that will not take into account personal and aggregated genomic information, as well as information coming in from smart sensors, which I'll come to in a moment. But just to set the scene a bit more, about 2 to 3%, depending on how you want to account for it, of children are born with a serious genetic disorder. In the more common and better understood ones are cystic fibrosis and thalassemia, which is a loss of hemoglobin. But there are thousands of these disorders because there are about 20,000 conventional genes that can be damaged. And when these conventional genes, which encode proteins as opposed to the information for our development, are damaged, we're in big trouble, because it's like having a broken component in a car. You may or may not notice it, but in most cases it's going to cause problems either up front or down back. Now, those individuals who have those genetic disorders, and it's very sad for them and their families, account for at least 10% of all the healthcare costs, according to a study in Western Australia a few years ago. A tremendous drag on society and families, but they were not able to be diagnosed. So, but now it's possible with genome sequencing to diagnose at least 50% of those, and sometimes with transformative outcomes. Even without the transformative outcomes, it's clear that this should be the standard of care, because the families are desperate to understand what's wrong with their children. If once they know, it gives them reproductive confidence, and in some cases, in many cases, it leads to improved treatments, sometimes transformative. Health economic analyses are really starting to show that even at the current price, which is not all that cheap, including the analysis, that it's actually is more cost effective to do the genome sequencing than it is to put these families and their children through the diagnostic odysseys they normally face, trying to track down the causes of their problem. And that's not even taking into account the millions that are saved over a lifetime in those cases where full health can be restored. I was part of a health economics study recently which showed that the average cost of intellectual disability due to genetic, and mainly due to genetic causes, is roughly $250,000 per child or per individual per year across the whole society. Many of those costs are borne outside the healthcare system in social support systems. We will be able to accurately predict and avoid such genetic disorders in the future by preconception screening. We'll be able to prevent the 7% of hospital admissions that are due to toxic reactions to prescribed medications because of variations in the enzymes that metabolize these drugs. And it may surprise you to learn that about 30% on average of all prescriptions are wasted. The entire pharmacopoeia of the country, 30% is wasted because of underdosing at the other end of the spectrum, because the drug prescriptions and the drug company tests for licensing are done at an average dose, which gives sufficient efficacy and not so bad toxicity, so that there's a minimal number of people who are slow metabolizers and think coffee. Some people can have a cup of coffee and go straight to bed, and other people are, wired for 24 hours. It's not their different response to caffeine, it's the different rates of clearance of the drug. So people who are slow clearers of drugs can have toxic reactions. Those that are fast clearers have no therapeutic benefit whatsoever. But we can avoid many of those problems, both the underdosing and overdosing in the future. We can pick up the 3/4 of people who are undiagnosed carriers of familial hypercholesterolemia, who are going to have at least a 50% chance of a catastrophic cardiovascular event later in life if not treated, and that's very easy to treat. We'll pick up the small proportion of people who are carrying around cardiac mutations, which means they're at high probability of dropping dead. You remember the case of Dean Mercer a few years ago in Queensland. And there are, therapies or pacemakers or pharmaceuticals that can be used to prevent that outcome. I could go on and on, but basically having the information about our personal genomes means that we can identify and anticipate many of the both acute risks from damaged protein coding genes and general risks for complex diseases well in advance, and take mitigating action that is much more personal, precise, preventative, and participative. Now, when you combine that prospect, and this is not pie in the sky, this will come Now, there's a lot of soil to till organisationally, socially, etc. And I think that we haven't done, as a community, a good job of selling the value proposition of this to the general public. But there's an incredible value proposition, and we just need to realise that when you combine that genomic information with the increasing feedback information that people are getting or able to get with smart sensors that are either general for heart rate or number of steps you've climbed every day or your sleep-wake patterns, or specific sensors that might be implanted into pharmaceuticals or on your skin for particular reasons, then we're not only going to have an idea at a personal, precise level about our genetic risks, but also real-time physiological information which might give early warning of those risks or help us to understand the diagnosis that might be made from the two sets of information. Now, my concern and my interest is to help bring that to fruition. I imagine going to see a physician in 20 years' time where the physician pulls up my record on the screen and says, well, let's have a look. And we discuss the situation that might be that she might say, John, you're looking all right for a bloke your age, but you might have a cholesterol problem. We need to look into that, and I want you to take this prescription to head it off. It'll be a much more participative, precise, personal, and preventative. And I like the saying going from illness to wellness, that the healthcare system will be designed to understand our personal circumstances, both genetic and environmental, much more precisely and integrate that information. So what do we need to do to get there? I think the vision is clear and it's realistic. The question is, what do we do to get there? And I've watched with some alarm the difficulty Australian Digital Health Agency has had as engaging the public in terms of amalgamated health records, which seem to me to be a terribly sensible idea. But the value proposition, both the patient and the healthcare system, hasn't been, I don't think, as well promoted as it might be. We need to set up the infrastructure for this, and that means secure, highly secure databases. It means analytical systems so that both researchers and healthcare professionals and healthcare system managers can interrogate the data and use it both for personal healthcare, but also for discovery and system management. And we need software systems that can deliver that information to the point of care. And I think this is a national endeavour. Again, with that encounter with me and the physician in a few years' time, that physician's going to want to know that what's on his or her screen is well curated, evidence-based, and linked to national guidelines for best treatment. And so we have to build the infrastructure of that so that a busy clinician at the point of care can get the information reliably, at best practice, evidence-based, etc. None of these things have been thought about strategically in any jurisdiction that I'm aware of, including in England, where they actually have a fairly advanced program. But the way in which you take using genomic information from simple genetic diagnosis of disorders like cancer or genetic inherited disorders to an empowerment for the system to change from crisis management to wellness management is the real challenge. I should say I've skipped over cancer, but you know, some of the wonderful works under the Kinghorn Cancer Centre with David Thomas and others and around the country showing that there's an enormous improvement in cancer outcomes from actually sequencing the tumour, because cancer ultimately is a genetic disorder. It's an acquired genetic disorder, partly inherited. So if you've got a damaged gene, you've got a higher risk for cancer, but partly environmental because of damage from radiation or smoking or whatever. But cancer is actually caused by a kaleidoscope of mutations, but the range of mutations is similar in different cancers. And I'll give an example very brief in a minute, just to illustrate this. So when one looks at a cancer, you know, the current modality is for a pathologist to say, gee, that looks bad, you know, it's grade 3 or Gleason grade 6 or something. And it's really an informed assessment of how aggressive the cancer looks at a cellular level. But underneath that, we don't know which mutation is driving the cancer. And now there are now an increasing number of drugs that actually will target particular mutations. About 15% of breast cancers, for example, are caused by mutations in a gene called HER2. There's a drug called Herceptin, which treats that. About 3%, I understand, of pancreatic cancers, maybe 8% of colon cancers are caused by the same mutation. So you can repurpose the drug for that purpose. But you wouldn't do it just on the off chance. There is a case of 2 little girls that the Garvan and the Children's Cancer Institute diagnosed recently here in Randwick at the Children's Hospital. One had a thoracic sarcoma that was crushing her chest. It was so large it couldn't be removed without killing her, and she was on oxygen. She was dying. We sequenced the tumour with some funding from the Lions clubs, Lions Foundation, which was fantastic, and discovered that she had a particular sort of mutation for which a drug had just been developed in the United States. And we had that drug brought out and treated her with it, and she has now been declared disease-free. Just down the hall from her, another little girl, unrelated, had a glioma, a glioblastoma, a brain cancer, which is almost invariably fatal. And when we sequenced her cancer, she had exactly the same mutation, affecting the same gene. And she was treated with the same drug successfully for a while, unfortunately, and I can't say much more about it, she's relapsed, but she did respond very well to the drug initially. But the point is that the first little girl wouldn't have been alive, and the second little girl would have had no hope without the genome sequencing. And in fact, they both had the same cancer, and it was necessary to do that. So I think it will be unacceptable, unethical, not to use genome analysis for any child that has an undiagnosed serious physical or intellectual disorder. And it'll be unethical and unacceptable not to use the same thing for cancer treatment in the future. About the survival rates with this genetic diagnosis are improving enormously, and the informal figures that are coming back are the 50% extension of life, and also identification of people who are going to respond very well to immunotherapies as well. So, you know, to me, it's clear, and I suspect for most people who are listening and participating today, that acquiring genomic information in a considered way with other data, clinical data, pharmaceutical record data, smart sensor data, is going to change the whole way in which we approach individual health and healthcare systems and management, making enormous savings to the healthcare system, which is going to be increasingly stressed with an aging population, and making enormous differences to the quality of life and national productivity. I think what is lacking is not so much a reasonably logical extrapolation into the future, but is the ability of the system, all of us, to step back and say, can we imagine what the healthcare system of the future could and should look like if we could do this properly? If we could bring this data all together into a highly secure national repository, we could then have artificial intelligence range over this data to look for patterns in the data, to find new correlations between genetic variation or environmental factors, the intersection between the two, and health outcomes, which can then be fed back in real time to physicians who are linked to that system to say, look, we've just picked up a particular correlation which might affect your patients A, B, C, and D, and we think you should be aware of it, and perhaps at the appropriate time discuss that with them. You get the idea. I think there's a tremendous opportunity, a rare one for any country, including this one, Australia, to lead in this way, because it's all there to play for, but it really needs a strategic vision and plan at the highest levels to create the infrastructure as well as the social licenses to move down this pathway, so that in the future, we're not turning up to the doctors when we're in severe crisis, but we're actually having the whole healthcare system orientated towards avoiding those crises in a personalised, precise way in the future. So that's what I'd like to see happen, and I'm doing my best with many of the colleagues, some of whom are in the audience, to try to achieve that vision. And I'm very happy to discuss it or any other aspect of what I've said today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As Doug mentioned, I'm the CEO of Advance.org, and my name is Maria MacNamara. I feel privileged to have been a part of this evening's conversation with John. And it speaks to me of finally knowing rather than guessing, which is something we're all aspiring to do. I'll be facilitating the next part of the conversation, and we'll begin by posing the questions we've received from those of you who wrote in. Firstly, thank you, John, for sharing your insights with us. As always, very illuminating. Okay, so the first question we received was as follows. We've seen that when a society puts the collective good above the rights of the individual, it has the capacity to smash the impact of a pandemic. Where there's a will, there's a way. Do you think we will have the will to move our healthcare system from a crisis response model to a wellness management model? And more importantly, do you think we have the know-how and the will to close the gap in the healthcare prospects of our Indigenous brothers and sisters?
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for sharing this evening. Look, they're two different questions, although they do overlap. Look, I think we can easily have the will. I mean, the response of societies all around the world, but particularly here in Australia, where people have happily curtailed their personal freedoms in the interests of the greater good, has worked very well, and I think it's a testimony to the good sense of the citizens. But also their engagement in the mutual mission of, in this case, trying to slow down the spread and get a pandemic under control. I mean, so I think the trick here in terms of making the move to the future in the healthcare system is to, first of all, engage the public in the value proposition. I think we don't do that well enough. When, as you may know, some of you know, I speak publicly quite a bit, or I used to, and I've never failed to engage the general public in the mission of what we not only trying to achieve, but what we have achieved. And I think it's very important to show people tangible examples of what you can do. That's why I tell the story of those little girls, rather than just what you think you might do in the future. And when I say the general public, I'm not just talking about people in the civil service, public service, or our political leadership, but local apex clubs, Lions clubs, etc. I think everybody gets it. But we do have a challenge because it's very easy to raise the boogeyman of privacy, etc. And there are real issues there, but there are also solutions to those issues that can reassure people that personal information, which can often be very sensitive, is kept private. I think one of the things we have to think about is creating systems where people have personal control of the information and they decide who gets access to it, their doctor, or I would hope with their permission in aggregated form for research so that we can improve our understanding of how genetic variation affects our health futures. So I think it's about really about explaining the value proposition all up and down the system, from the health minister and the prime minister, who because some of this requires a whole of government response. Treasury should know that this is going to be one of the most powerful influences on national productivity, but also Australia, for example, speaking as an Australian, potential to participate in one of the major industrial transitions of this time. And you only get once in a generation opportunity to do that. So I would start there and say, once you have convinced with evidence and logic the leadership of the nation and the citizens, then we can do it. We could do it really easily. We could, for trivial amounts of money compared to what's being spent, to prevent the pandemic, and I don't mean to imply any criticism there, we could have teams of people who are actually writing the software to automatically annotate genomes, to deliver it in straightforward ways to cardiologists and GPs, etc. And I should also mention that there will be resistance to these changes, and we have to be sensitive to people whose modus operandi may be different. And this is particularly true of the clinical geneticists, who I think are used to working in one model and not so enthusiastic about the democratization of genetics. So, I think we have to respect their expertise, involve them, but also work at big vision, and then down to roll your sleeves up. How do we get there? And I don't think it takes terribly large amounts of money. There's more than enough money in the Medical Research Future Fund to do this, but that's where we have to start. After that, it's all process and continued engagement. As respect to our first Indigenous peoples, I'm an amateur in that regard, but I think many of us who watch with concern about their situation realise that it's a deep social and cultural issue that comes from clash of cultures, perhaps many, many years of disempowerment and dispossession, and we have to rebuild those communities from the ground up almost, but with their involvement. I sometimes think, we all have to join the world, and we have to be particularly sensitive to those that have had difficulties because of the way the world's behaved in the past.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions from a couple of our guests. You talked about some of the barriers and areas of resistance to making them happen. Are there any others? And more specifically, which disease types or patient groups do you expect to be the first to benefit from your mission in life of transforming the healthcare system through genomics? For example, can you see a time when tumours in children undergo the genome sequencing before the cancer treatment begins?
Well, the answer to the last question is yes.
The two girls, that's right.
Tomorrow, as quickly as possible, because it does, well, it depends on the nature of the treatment, because, if you pick it up early enough, surgery is the first option, of course. So let me just work on that one just for a minute, because I want to also bring up something that David Thomas showed with colleagues in the United States recently, was that people who have inherited damage to genes that are involved in cancer are at elevated risk for cancer. And I think, and David's working on this, I know you can actually, I think, predict with increasing accuracy who is going to get cancer and who may not over a lifetime, and the risk, so that you can then stratify your screening procedures. And what David and colleagues in the United States showed was that people who had a particular damage in a particular cancer gene at high risk, when they, and the point of the story of the two little girls, by the way, is that most cancer genes, unlike BRCA, which is, breast and ovarian, largely specific, and there's another gene called Lynch syndrome for colon cancer, but most genes that cause cancer are tissue agnostic, and they can cause cancer anywhere in the body. So if you've got a genetic predisposition because you've inherited a damaged gene from one of your parents, then, and this is the point about getting cancer, you see, if in most cases you've got to get both genes damaged before you get cancer. So if both genes are healthy, then the chances that the same gene will be damaged in any one cell are very remote. It's like lightning striking twice. But if one copy is damaged in every cell, then lightning's only got to hit you in one cell and you're in trouble. Oversimplifying, but you get the point. So what David showed was that these people, that 1 in 10 of them had pre-symptomatic cancers they weren't aware of, ticking away like time bombs until they metastasized and became obvious, and then the system had to throw the bus at them to try to throw their lives. So genomic testing will identify, and this is part of the answer to your first part of the question, Maria, is identify those people who are at high risk for cardiac disease or cancer. And so it's a very good question about where do you start on this journey. And in fact, that's what I did in England. I wrote for the National Vision and Plan, which was announced by the Secretary of State last year. And the simple logic was, if we accept that in 20 years' time it'll be standard in healthcare, then the immediate question is, what do we do for the next 5 years? Now, part of it is, building the infrastructure sensibly so that we can deliver this information, in a well-curated, evidence-based way at the point of care. The other part is which patient populations do you engage first? So I'd say people with a family history of cardiac disorders or cancer, you would do those. It's where the value proposition is most, because what you want to do is address unmet medical need and show value while you're building the whole infrastructure. So one of my favourites is what we call exceptional responders in any branch of medicine. I remember talking in Toowoomba once up in Queensland about this, and two GPs in the audience stuck their hands up and said, well, I've got one of those. These are individuals that respond really well or really badly to a standard treatment, and there was a classic example, is a case of a woman in Melbourne some years ago who had what's called an abscopal response. Now, the physicians in the audience, and I can see a few, may understand that word. It's actually a term for a response in curing cancer from a local treatment. And this lady had melanoma stage 4, and she was really, in big trouble. She had a radiation treatment of one of the tumours in her brain, presumably take pressure off, or relieve pain or whatever, give her a few more months of life. And in the following weeks and months, every other tumour in the body disappeared. And she's fine, as far as I know, last time we looked. And so we sequenced her genome and found that she had a rare immunological mutation, which we interpret to say that when the cancer cells were zapped in the brain, they released antigens or fragments into the bloodstream, and a titchy immune system reacted and then not only attacked that one but all the other cancers. So that's actually a new pathway for treating cancer that's has got a lot of potential. So I love the idea of exceptional responders. Also has the great, I think, social engagement aspect of engaging the GPs, because you can say that those people in Toowoomba or anywhere else, if you got them, bring them to us. We'd like to study them, and because they're a route to discovery, new therapies, new insights, etc. So a mixed portfolio of discovery, interest, and real good value for in cancer, cardiac disease, and any other area where you think you can identify a subpopulation of people who might benefit immediately from such analysis.
Excellent. Sally Evans from Helios asks the question regarding genetic testing. How do we avoid the scenario where genetic testing results impact access to or pricing for health or life insurance?
Yeah, terrific question. And I'm going to give an unusual answer because I think it's going to change those things for the better. Now, the question of health insurance is a jurisdictional issue because in Australia, we're very fortunate that health insurance, including private health insurance, as most of the audience would know, is community risk rated. So we cannot be penalised in any way or refused insurance or made to pay higher premiums because of our genetic circumstances. The question is, and it's a thorny one, is life and employment insurance, because that's elective in a sense. And the Canadian government recently outlawed any discrimination in any form of insurance because I think the issue of people rorting the system has perhaps been exaggerated. But you could eliminate one or two of the obvious cases like Huntington's disease if you want to just make one or two exceptions. The British government have put a moratorium on genetics in life insurance, but come to no decision. I've been talking to the life insurance industry here and overseas, and I put it to them, and I think I'm getting some traction, that if they know and the patients know and the physicians know of genetic risk, say cardiac risk, which is normally you're penalised for in life insurance if you have a family history, you will know whether that individual is at acute risk because you'll know whether they've inherited the damaged gene or not. In the latter case, you can actually say, we'll still insure you as long as you put the pacemaker in. So you actually reduce the risk of having to pay out. And of course, the patients don't mind because they're not going to die, or if you understand. The issue is how you get compliance for the mitigating action. But I do think that there are solutions between legal protections, blanket legal protections, but also the constructive approach to that information, which will actually improve outcomes for patients and for the insurance companies. So I see, you know, it could be a win-win.
I think it just takes both sides wanting to succeed.
Yes.
Professor Donald Chambers is with us. He's the Professor of Physiology and Biophysics at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. And he asks, we have many people, he's among the many people we have joining from overseas. He says, you've been involved in an advisory capacity with different state and federal governments. How do you pursue agendas that protect the integrity of science and meet political objectives?
I think I'd rather redefine the latter as a social objective, because what I've tried to do through my career and others, I think, in the audience, is to convince our political leadership that there are valuable objectives. I've never found health to be anything other than a bipartisan interest across the political spectrum. It's and I've never been in a situation where I've had to think about playing politics in the ideological sense in this area. So I think, to answer Don's question straight up, I think once you talk about the value proposition and you make the case, and what my experience, and a particularly pleasant one working with Premier Beattie in Queensland many years ago, is that our political leadership are not domain experts. And they rely on the advice of domain experts to make decisions and choices on behalf of the people. They have to trust that domain expert. So it's very important, I think, not to be political. And you see that happening in perhaps other domains of science discussion, because the first thing is to gain the trust, and then your political leadership, if they trust your advice as being well-informed and well-intentioned, not self-interested, and not partisan, will follow that advice. So I think you keep your integrity at every level, including scientific integrity, by being straightforward about the value proposition that you're putting forward, and treating, I think, also our political leadership with great respect.
Thank you. As Doug mentioned earlier, we're delighted that former Health Minister for New South Wales, the Honourable Jillian Skinner, is with us. She asks, if you had a chance to nominate one major initiative that would make a difference to the health and well-being of people, what would it be?
Hello, Jillian. Who's a dear friend. She was fantastic. I should say to everybody, you probably know, but Jillian was an inspired health minister who actually nominated herself, I think the first in the country, maybe one of the first in the world, as also the Minister for Medical Research. And because she understood very much that the route to a better future was research and the translation of that research into improved healthcare. If I had to nominate one thing, Jillian, I think I would say to decide to build the infrastructure for the data future that's going to drive genomic medicine. To make that decision, and then make the subsidiary decisions that when you get that information, it's always being thought about being put into that environment. So our researchers and our health professionals and our health managers can use that data. At the moment, it's all over the shop, and there's no effort, even thought, about how to collect that data in an integrated and properly protected way. I mean, I'll just make another point, if I may. I used to think the 20th century was the century of biology and medicine because of the great advances in gene cloning and sequencing and so forth. I was wrong. That was just the warm-up. This is the century of biology and medicine. And it's going to be partly, if not largely, achieved through the analysis of big data. Now, that's a sort of mot du jour, you know, it's almost become superficial. But you imagine when you have millions of genomes and millions of data points from sensors and pharmaceutical records, etc., and then you can start looking through that with artificial intelligence, and you say, wow. In fact, one of my great postdocs, he was from New Zealand, said to me many years ago, he said, John, I can see the day when we'll come in the morning and the computer will see you coming and say, good morning, John, you've got your coffee. Guess what I found overnight? Guess what I found overnight? And you know, a sort of silly example might be, I've just worked out that all the women who suffered preeclampsia and pregnancy have this particular issue, genomic or other. And that immediately can be translated back into practice. But unless you've got all that data in one place, you can never do that. So it supercharges discovery as well as translation. They become the same thing. So that's what I would do.
Which is tremendous, because there's such an investment in quantum computing in New South Wales. We have a cluster of researchers. So can you imagine when that technology becomes available?
Yeah.
So we're going to take some questions from the floor now, and I'm aware that many of you have those questions. So if you put your hand up, our team will send me a note and I'll invite you to ask your questions. If you can make them brief, we can get through many questions this evening. And we'll begin with one from Judith Wheeldon.
Hello, Jillian.
There, now, hi, John. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And in a time when we need hope, it certainly gives us an awful lot of that, so it's great. I'm interested in your comment about making developing the strategic vision and plan. And my first couple of questions all grouped together. Who are the people who need to be involved in devising that vision and the plan, in articulating it? I don't necessarily mean the names of the individuals,
No,
but
positions.
What positions do you see need to be represented? Sub-question, is that possibly a way that we can ensure a social justice view of the outcome, thinking not only of obvious examples like Indigenous people, but people who don't have the financial resources that some of us have, ensuring that they're all included, which I presume is something that you would also value. And to whom does this report go to ensure that action will happen?
It's a good question, and there are different dynamics in different jurisdictions. I think in Australia we do have both an ethos and a system that really does deliver very high quality healthcare to every citizen. Some people on higher incomes pay a bit of private insurance, and that gives them earlier access to, you know, cosmetic surgery or discretionary surgery, but that's about because you've got to have some value in paying the extra money. But we have a terrific system here. I really believe, having lived in other countries, including the UK, that we probably have the best system, not perfect, but the best system in the world. So dealing with disadvantaged groups, including people who perhaps are living in poverty, is a different challenge in different jurisdictions in healthcare. But to answer your main question, I think the positions that should be involved are the most senior positions in the country. I would have, if I had to pick off the top of my head, I'd have the head of Treasury. I've had the Health Secretary or Health Minister. I'd have the Science Minister, people who are responsible for social services. And I'd have a small group of big thinkers that have high reputations in the community, and reputations not only for being big thinkers, but for being trustworthy people who are sensitive to the social contract that we have to build. If you get too much of a committee structure, then you end up going to lowest common denominator. You need vision, a bold vision, but one that is really thoughtful and sensitive and has at the front of the mind putting forward the value proposition to society. Get your social license first, and that includes the equity issues as well. So sometimes people say that new technologies, shouldn't be developed because there will be inequities. There always are. I mean, some people got smartphones before others. But as the costs come down and so forth, then they get democratized very quickly, especially if society has an intention in terms of a social equality to make sure that happens quickly. So there are two elements here. One is how to improve the system using your technology, knowledge base, and strengths and structures, and the other is to make sure that as quickly and as uniformly as possible that benefits are available across the society, because I believe, I think most people do, that access to good health is a right, not a privilege, and that any modern society should have that baked into their structures. But I think it has to be the highest level. I'm very wary. I've been to discussions in places here and overseas where not everybody in the room was a big thinker, and you end up, being nickled and dimed to death. So the decision makers and some big thinkers, but ones who actually understand. Maybe one or two of them actually came from a poor background, so they do understand, and they could put forward a vision that people can sign up to.
That's a great answer. So the people who can say yes. The next question comes from Advance.org's chairman, Yasmin Allen. Yasmin's also on the board of the Stock Exchange, Cochlear and Santos. We weren't expecting her this evening, and we're delighted she's with us.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks, John, for your fascinating, not that I can understand it all, but I'm absolutely fascinated by...
Well, I've failed, Yasmin, because...
No, you've done a great job. Actually, I do have to disclose up front that my daughter, India, has an internship at the Garvan. She's studying neuroscience at University of Sydney, and she's been very lucky to be working on a genomics project looking into cancer with some of your credible researchers. And I have to say, she's so inspired by it. I think we might lose her to medical research, which I wouldn't be disappointed about. So thanks for that as well. But I think my question is a little bit similar to Judith's, along the lines of, you've adequately or very well described precision medicine and the successes you've had in cancer, and then also highlighting the external databases that we really need to understand in order to take into account environmental factors in disease, particularly chronic disease. And so I think what I'd like to suggest maybe is you add to your list of people on that committee other tech people, obviously ethicists and technology, because what we're really talking about here, as you've rightly said, is big data and AI. And the problem with AI is that if you build it in an ad hoc way, which is what we are currently doing, in fact, globally, and particularly in Australia, around these external databases, then the rules aren't set up front. And then we don't know what these huge machines are sort of, the answers they're giving us, we don't really understand the assumptions and the predictions that they're making. So, I think being able to predict health is a really laudable goal, and I really and I'm sort of on your side, and I want that to happen. But I do also look at China and the social credit system there, and I do look at our supermarkets actually know more about our health than we do, and they are sharing that data already with the insurers and our employers. And so it's that sort of constructive approach, is how do we get ahead of this? I mean, I think the horse is probably already bolted with AI, but it's not necessarily that ethics in the medical sector, because people like you, I haven't met an unethical biochemist ever, but I think that the people building the AI either don't understand or are driven by the wrong drivers, just as we've seen with the robo-debt crisis and things like that.
Yeah, very good point, Yasmin. I agree with you entirely. Inside that room, you need at least one person who's a big thinker in tech space and familiar with the issues that have to be addressed there to do it. You want somebody who's, just to fill back out again, somebody who's a senior medical ethicist. I know one or two, I won't mention names, but just superb, who are not there to criticise, but there to make sure that there's, a thoughtful perspective. So I agree. In respect of the thing with AI, as I understand it, and I've recruited AI experts, including the father of one of the kids whose lives we saved at the Garvan, who now works at the Garvan in AI. The first and biggest problem practically is just assembling the data. And at the moment, we don't do that in any organised way. I am aware that in Geelong, there is centres that look at the data, and I've got a very good friend down there, Sveta Venkatesh, who's a national specialist in AI, and she talks about this. She can actually predict with higher accuracy than the psychiatrist who's going to attempt suicide, just based on analysis of patterns, which is, she's extraordinary. So, but if I was sitting inside the room and someone like you were there or somebody knew about this domain, I would say, well, okay, how do we get that supermarket data into our privacy protected domain so they can, because yes, you can actually see what diets people are eating very easily from that sort of information. So there's got to be a strategic approach to assembling the data, and there's a lot of data out there. And if it's used to good effect, it can be used to very good effect, not just for the insurance companies or other people. So there's no, as far as I know, national coordination towards trying to get that data for public good purposes into an integrated environment. So I think that's the big challenge. The problem with AI is that when it pops out an answer, as you know, and you said, you don't know why it got there. But you can verify the accuracy of the prediction in other ways. So, it's got extraordinary potential because none of us have got enough brain cells to analyze, millions of genomes at the same time, but computers do now. So it's something we should be heading for, but one that's done in a thoughtful and informed way. So,
Thank you. We're going to go to Paul Davies, the director of Beyond Center at Arizona State University, and then we're going to end with a question from Jillian. And I know that there will be other questions. We're happy to receive them and forward them on to John so that we can then publish the answers to him. So if we can go to Paul Davies now, please.
I'm unmuted. It's great to see you again, and as you can tell from the background, I'm not actually in Arizona, I'm in Sydney at the moment. But enough of that. So I have a question about sequencing of cancer genomes and tumor heterogeneity. So if you have an inherited cancer, of course, all the cells are going to have that particular genetic signature. But if it's a sporadic cancer, I think most cancers are probably sporadic, then you're faced with this hideous problem that no two cells are likely to have the same pattern of mutations. But with AI, it's entirely possible that there will be hidden patterns. So we're talking not about a specific mutation, but a whole network of mutations and an informational signature that characterizes that network. So as a practical matter, what do you do about sequencing a tumor? Just mash up all the cells and get some sort of average, or do we foresee single cell sequencing in the near future? And there's still an awful lot of cells in a tumor.
There are. That's a good question, Paul. Thank you. What I would say is that most tumors have some foundational mutations, what you might call driver mutations. And then as they grow and divide, they get this genetic heterogeneity. And so I'm just trying to work out which order to say this. You can attack the foundational mutation with some success, and the figures out of Utah that I saw last year and others that I'm aware of are showing a 50% increase in survival by using targeted therapies. So that's says that if you actually identify a driver mutation in the tumor, as heterogeneous as it may be, you can at least delay things quite successfully. Now, with spasmodic and sporadic tumors, they have to be sequenced because you don't have any other guidance. You don't know which mutations cause them, so that's very valuable information to get. You may have seen this, but David Thomas and colleagues published a paper in Science last week out of the Garvan showing that when you treat tumours with these drugs, they go into stress response mode, almost like bacteria. And they activate pathways which increase the frequency of mutations, which is why you get resistance or breakouts. But having identified those pathways and why it was a paper in Science, was because you can then block those pathways and inhibit the possibility of heterogeneous breakout in cancer treatments. So, and single cell sequencing will also reveal the heterogeneity of other mutations, which, it's a bit of a war game with cancer. But the progress that's being made is extraordinary, Paul, and I would say to anybody who's listening publicly or on this, that if you have cancer and you don't get it sequenced, you're nuts. You have to have that information because it does put you in at least a 50% better chance of dealing with that cancer in a productive way.
Thank you very much, John. And now the final question to Jillian Skinner.
Thank you very much, and thank you, John, for, as always, a very inspiring address. I've got a couple of points. I'm on the board of the Children's Cancer Institute, so the story that you told, her name is Ellie, and anyone can look it up on the web, Ellie's story. The point of raising it was the publicity that was around the treatment of that and other children using genomic sequencing of the tumour, etc., has led now to the federal minister funding every child with cancer in Australia to be treated through this program. So it really is about the way to get buy-in, you know, at the highest level, but also the community, because the public clamoured to have this happen. So that's one thing. The other is another group that I'm working with, and I see Trevor Danos is here somewhere as well, he's with me on this, is a project that's being funded through the MRFF, a frontier grant on antimicrobial resistance. And it's looking at collecting data, then using analysis, AI and other mechanisms to look at the frequency and the location of antimicrobial resistance. But it's a One Health approach. It's looking not just at the health system, but animal, plant, the environment, water and everything. I mean, to me, that's where we really need to be going if we're going to be talking about a wellness model of care. Do you agree?
I do, Jillian. I do. I mean, with antibiotics, it's a particular issue with the environmental use of antibiotics in agriculture. And in fact, I thought for a long time it's not the hospitals are the problem. It's pouring the antibiotics, you know, into the streams and in the chicken farms and so forth. But in a more general sense, I think you're quite right. I think it's a mixture of environment and genomes. We need to get that data in the one place. I think the program you mentioned sounds terrific. My one comment would be that the MRFF is not being used strategically at the moment. It's being used to fund really good projects like that one. I would like to see another layer where the data that's brought in from those things is brought into a central location so it can be used in other dimensions. I think, and this is an Australian thing, I apologise to my international participants, but with $1 billion a year to spend discretionarily, if that money was used astutely and strategically, we could change the world. So I'd like to see that component brought in on top of the project mix. So, yeah.
We have time very quickly for one last question from Jenny Nethery from the Menarini group. Apologies, Jenny, for mangling that name.
That's okay. I'm just trying to see if you got me on the, can you see me now?
We can see the name, Jenny.
We can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you very much, John. That's been a very insightful presentation. I really appreciate it. But my question is I actually work in the pharmaceutical industry, and I was just really keen to understand what's the best way to work in with you. I understand that the industry does supply you drugs for your research. I'm just wondering from your point of view, what's the best way to connect in with you and to partner with you on that in the future? Because we do have a pipeline of drugs, of cancer products coming down the pipeline in future years. I'm just interested in your response to that.
Well, thank you, Jenny, and it's very kind of you. And in fact, we're finding increasing interest in that sort of engagement from the pharmaceutical industry, which is very welcome. Before I answer the question specifically, I'd just make another point I didn't make in the rest of the presentation. That is that using genomic analysis in phase 1, 2 and 3, phase 1 and 2 clinical trials will make an extraordinary difference to the success of those trials. Because at the moment, at phase 2, as you would know, you're trying to find a dose which is safe but efficacious at the same time. And given that there's quite a variation in response to drugs because of cytochrome P450 levels or whatever, it's very hard to find that dose. But once you can stratify your patients, then you get a much higher success rate. And the phase 3 trials become much easier. And the FDA will terminate phase 3 trials early, not because they're not working, but because they work so well. And I've got a number of examples of that. So that will reduce the cost of drug development. It will also rescue many drugs that have failed phase 2 because they were toxic to some patients and not others, because they can be rescued to help those patients for which they weren't toxic and were very effective. So I think the whole dynamics of pharmaceutical discovery and the cost structures will change with that information being superimposed or incorporated into the drug trials. With respect to how you could help, not me personally, but the enterprise, I'd suggest contacting people like David Thomas in the cancer area, because David not only does the work at the Garden, but he runs a whole consortium across the country at Peter Mac and other places. Sorry, Jenny?
Perfect.
Yeah, I've been in touch with him as well.
Sorry, so I couldn't hear what Jenny was saying. Jenny?
I think she's been in touch with him as well.
Oh, right, okay. So my only final comment there would be that David has been very grateful and very active in getting pharmaceutical companies to provide leading edge drugs for free that he can then test in trials with the patients, which helps the patients and the molecular therapeutics trial, and of course helps the companies to get those drugs tested onto market more quickly and more efficiently.
Thank you so much. Now, we're going to conclude the Q&A, and when you receive your wrap-up email, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask additional questions, and if John doesn't mind, we'll share those with him and then publish the responses on the website. But for now, that's it for the Q&A. Thank you again, and back to Doug.
Thank you, Maria.
Thanks, Maria, and great job as usual. John, an incredibly insightful and engaging discussion with you. Clearly, you're a wonderful example to Australia's scientific and medical leadership, and a wonderful ambassador for advance.org.